Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. We'll have two student presentations today, and our first presentation will be by Kristina. Kristina studied political science and political theory before obtaining a degree in women's studies at Wadham College. After that degree, she went on to work in the technology sector in London for a year before she returned to Oxford to do a DPhil in women's studies, and her research focuses on political and feminist theory, and especially on women in finance.
Only minor correction, there is no DPhil in gender or women's studies.
Yeah.
I need to emphasize that because now I'm in geography, which might be confusing, but I'm doing research in financial or economic geography. But just to clarify that, because that also very much influences my research or what I'm presenting. What I'm going to present today is actually my master's dissertation, or the research I did for my master's, and it's very much providing the foundation for the research that I am about to do now during my DPhil. I'm going to quickly start with this picture that I took last summer. All of the German speakers will now be of advantage, but I'm going to translate it for you. This was lined up in the main hall if you went into Commerzbank in the headquarters in Frankfurt, and it said, protect our most valuable asset, our reputation. And it's really interesting that Commerzbank is very much going down this road of emphasizing these kind of values. After the financial crisis, they launched a massive campaign, and there was one public campaign, and there was one advertisement which I find incredibly interesting, where they actually had one woman running down in the morning the river, and they were like chronicling the bank's history, and then she entered the bank in the morning as like someone who works there as a manager. And it was interesting because it's so at odds with the company itself, because only 1 out of 7 executive board members are women. And out of I looked it up, 20 people in the advisory board, 6 by now are women, but because they're forced to, because the German law has been implemented, I think last year, that 30% of women need to be in boards. So it's really interesting that these kind of public depictions are so at odds with how finance itself is quite a masculine domain up until today. So what I'm going to briefly do in the next 15 minutes, I'm going to talk about background and the research problem of my master's dissertation, outline the research questions, and then I'm going to present to you the case study that I did. I did 10 interviews in Frankfurt and in London, present the results. I'm going to use a lot of the quotes to kind of tell the stories of the women that I spoke to, and then I'm going to finish up with some conclusions and implications, and hopefully something to discuss afterwards. So where did all of my research start? When I became interested in politics, it was very much the time when the financial crisis unfolded of 2008. And Sarah Hall wrote about the crisis-prone nature of the post-Bretton Woods system. And there's a really, really interesting ethnography that I can highly recommend by Karen Ho. It's called Liquidated, about investment banking practices in the US. And her assumption basically was that the prevalence of instability and crisis does not signal the demise, but rather the strength of the financial systems, because crises are at the heart of finance. Which is why it is quite interesting, and there's a lot of debate about whether the global financial crisis was different or not. That was not really the prime research interest on my end, but rather the fact that in comparison to its predecessors, the global financial crisis was massively depicted in gender terms. And that, again, was at odds with the fact that finance itself is one of the few bastions of virtually uncontested masculine privilege. There was a lot of research that developed in the aftermath of the financial crisis, which kind of was dubbed the Lehman Sisters hypothesis. And I don't know whether you came across this one article, like, what if Lehman Brothers had been Lehman Sisters, had the crisis unfolded the way it did? And what was really interesting in all of this research, that there was a massive emphasis on gender difference as a variable to explain the causes as well as the consequences of the financial crisis. And there are 2 debates that remain to be quite central to my research. On the one hand, you have feminist accounts who massively criticize the lack of women in financial decision-making bodies, and also the fact that actually women were most affected by the negative outcomes of the crisis. And secondly, there's a lot of research in behavioral economics, and I don't know whether you've come across that as well, where like testosterone levels on the trading floor were measured. And there are quite some famous studies which are also quite heavily cited. And they, however, focus a lot, on masculinity and on gender stereotypes, and they totally neglect context and historical contingency, which is why I never focused on them, also because I did a very qualitative studies, and all of these behavioral accounts need to take into account a large quantitative basis. A lot of the critique that very much resonated in the aftermath of all of this research also centered around the fact that women's depictions as saviors very much limited their agency again, because women were kind of attributed this trustful behavior, whereas men are more risky, which in practice did not hold true to any of the women that I spoke to, which was quite interesting. And also it basically failed to acknowledge the diversity among women and the underlying power structures if you only look at gender stereotypes. But then there's obviously the question, why are these still so prevailing? And there's a really fascinating article by Julie Nelson, who's a feminist economist, who stated that the habit of much economics and finance to look for difference tends to serve the interests of those who want to sustain gender inequality and economic power. And I think that sums it up quite nicely why I didn't choose to go down the road on actually using those gendered or behavioral economics account as the backdrop of my study. And to sum that up, there's one further phenomenon that I need to mention. Because I obviously had to look, if I do feminist research and also if I speak to women, what kind of feminist era are we in? We had first wave feminism kind of focusing on political rights, second wave feminism focusing on equality with difference. And then there's something that now is often called like the post-feminist age. It's very much like neoliberalism become a big buzzword that everyone uses and no one really knows what it actually stands for, which is I only briefly want to mention the fact that that you can kind of single out two distinct and competing post-feminist strands, and one very much focusing as a mainstream backlash, and the other one as a postmodern feminism, which follows Judith Butler and Michel Foucault and these kind of theorists. But I'm very much focusing in my research on the first post-feminism, which has this notion that equality is achieved, but then equality is very much measured in the ability for women to participate in education, to consume, but it's not political equality, because most bodies of decision making women are still not able to enter them. And it was really interesting. I went to this conference 2 years ago now where Brenda Trenolan, who's the head of the 30% Club, and some of you might know that it's a very, very well-known campaign by now that was started in London for 30% of women on boards. And she very clearly stated when she introduced her campaign, she was like, we're not suffragettes. So she very emphasized the fact and was making a stance that this is not a political mission, but an economic mission, or like driven by economy, by profit. And I found that very interesting because feminism itself, for me, how I understood it still is a very political mission. And the other thing that I was very motivated when I started my research is that a lot of feminist papers that engage with the economy, there's always this reference made, well, why is there gender inequality? Because of neoliberalism. And that never really convinced me, because I really wanted to know what is actually happening there. And neoliberalism is such a buzzword and no one really dares to make the effort to explain what it is, that I kind of wanted to look, is it really the case that any kind of feminist or female activity is inevitably co-opted by the economy or by finance, or is there actually room for feminism in the economy? Because especially for the senior women that I interviewed, they only came into finance because in the aftermath of the second wave of feminism, like before that, they were not able to actually participate in the workforce. So this is kind of where I was starting. I had 3 research questions when I was starting my research. On the one hand, how do women navigate finance, defined as this very masculine space, and especially the stereotypes that shape not only their participation and representation, but also their work. What understanding of equality and empowerment does the finance industry nurture? And how do women in finance relate to movements and policies promoting gender equality? So because the aftermath of the crisis was massively gendered, but only the male perspective, at least in my perception, was prominently featured in the media. So you could always see those features of like the last male banker has now been, went to court and they say that he was responsible for this or that. There was no emphasis on women, and I really wanted to give like a small glimpse on women's perspective and kind of tell their stories. To quickly show you the case study, I interviewed 10 women. 6 of them were in junior positions, 4 of them were in senior positions. They were from all kinds of spheres: analysts, traders, human resources. Some of them studied, some of them did a vocational training, which is a big thing in Germany and not that big of a thing here in the UK. It's almost impossible for anyone to enter finance, at least for the senior women, if they didn't complete a vocational training beforehand. A lot of them interned beforehand, and what was also interesting, whether someone in their family had worked in finance beforehand, that very much motivated whether they chose to go into finance. And also, it was interesting that in the end, actually, one of my interview partners was pregnant, so I have to amend the figure in hindsight that 3 out of the 4 senior women that I interviewed also had children. I accessed them all through my personal network, so there's definitely a bias in that I didn't do any cold emailing. But because I lived in Frankfurt, it was incredibly easy for me to actually find interview partners. But I have to take into account that I obviously didn't speak to women who were not fond of my research project or overall. But I also need to add the caveat that I think that this is the case for any kind of research anyone is conducting, but for whatever reason, it seems to be a bit more important to mention it in that regard. So, and to kind of present you the results, I'm going to follow up with a few quotes because I found the themes really interesting and the narratives that evolved. The first thing that I found is that women were incredibly aware of their position as a female exception to the male rule. And a lot of them sought to make productive use of that, especially if it helped them to advance their business and their position. It was very much the case that the finance industry perpetuates a conservative stereotypes and gender roles, but this relationship between feminism and women working in finance was very complex and very ambiguous, and I found very ambiguous answers, and I'm going to put up some of those quotes up there. And what was the most interesting thing for me, which obviously made sense, but I was not aware of it before I went into the field, that there's a massive generational gap dividing senior and junior women. And the senior women were very supportive of gender and diversity policies, whereas the latter remained incredibly reluctant. The junior women very much followed this trope of meritocracy, and they wanted to advance because they were the best. They didn't want to be singled out as women, which was kind of interesting because all of their senior women had put up, for example, women's networks, but none of the junior women wanted to join them because they didn't want to be singled out. So yeah, I'm going to present a few quotes because I just found these really interesting, and I kind of rather want to let them speak than me paraphrasing what they said. There was one woman who was the first in her bank to ever become a marketing manager. She worked in Frankfurt her life, then came to London, and then went back to Frankfurt, did a sabbatical in between because she could afford to do that. And she said, I think as a woman, one always behaves differently compared to men. For example, banter is part of the trading floor. And this is particularly interesting. As we are German, it is very difficult to follow English banter. The English humor for a linguistic reason, because one sometimes lacks the proper words, but also because women share a very different type of humor, not as sexist, less sexist. Sometimes, yes, this is a very male sense of humor, which makes it difficult for women to join in. Of course, one behaves differently. I'm not really joining in the daily banter, but I never perceived this as a disadvantage. So it's really interesting how they obviously are aware of this very sexist culture, but they still try to stay away from it. And especially in her case, because she was a very senior woman, I felt that she just she never let it come too close to her, but just kept her distance from it. There was another woman, and that's the example of kind of women's attitudes towards feminism. She was also a senior woman. She worked in an international bank. And I found really interesting what she was saying about supporting women and about the investment that needs to be made and who needs to be involved in this process. So she said, if you want to invest in leadership, in women's leadership, you need to invest money. This won't change unless you spend money in it. But in this matter, I believe that a lot is being missed out on. I also think that management staff should be invited to those conferences because then all of this can be implemented much better. If only women sit together discussing what goes wrong, it will not get us anywhere. Men need to listen to what is constraining us, how we can make it better. In these cases, men need to assume a more active role in creating diversity. So she was very involved in the gender networks. In her company, she was in Frankfurt, but she flew out to London quite a few times, and I think even to the US. And she was putting a bit emphasis on the fact that men need to be involved. And she also mentioned, and I was not aware of that before, and that actually Commerzbank is the only German bank that offers like a kindergarten, which is why a lot of female talent actually stays at this bank. So it literally is as simple as that. She was not working for that German bank. And then kind of moving on to the junior female bankers, it was very interesting and very ambiguous what their perception on femininity and being a woman in finance was. And I was kind of saying earlier on how they used gender stereotypes to advance their case. And I think the first quote sums it up very nicely, and that's what a lot of junior women said. Honestly, I do not have any problems using my charm, and especially in cases of moody male senior managers, simply being a bit girly or feminine and to eventually achieve your aims with pleading and begging in a way I would not have been able to as a man. But then on the other side, there was also the stark contrast that they also complained about a certain financial femininity. And then what I sometimes find exhausting working in this bank is that a particular kind of femininity is expected from a woman. Well, you see women here on high heels with short skirts and beautifully made up, And this is when I sometimes ask myself, okay, what do you actually want to embody? Does it always need to be the little female suit? So there was a lot of complaining about how women played a certain feminine role, and how there was also this one way to be a woman in finance. I also asked them obviously about gender inequality, but very indirectly. And I never talked about children unless they themselves basically problematized that. And what was very interesting, that one of the senior female bankers, she addressed it very bluntly, and she was like, doing this job with children, impossible, well, very difficult. And all of the senior women that I spoke to who had children, either their husband stayed at home or they just had the money to afford whatever childcare. But they also were very emphasizing the fact you can't do this early on. Like, you need to be in the industry for about 10 to 15 years, and then you can take a break, but even then it can be still very challenging. The second quote was I found it a really interesting one, because this very much plays back to this post-feminist attitude that I was referring to. So I was asking always very indirect questions about, like, how do you perceive the diversity policies to be? And then this one junior female banker said, I always have this attitude, I have this perception that everything is relatively equal by now. Well, we are relatively equal, although I believe, well, it is, we're not completely equal, definitely not. So it was really interesting once they were talking about it, that they started out with this perception, everything is all right, but because I was kind of making them actually think about it, and in their daily work they were just not thinking as much about it as through my questions. And then there was another quote, which I think also speaks for itself, from one of the junior female bankers. I think that many people at my age or in my position do not know or haven't given so much thought to the obstacles that could be put in one's way later on, and simply are not aware of the issue at the moment. And I think that very well explains why there is just not that awareness among junior women, and which is why they're very reluctant to actually participate, for example, in women's networks. Women's networks are basically what I'm going to focus on probably for quite a lot of my default. I'm still in my first year, so I'm figuring out what is going to be the emphasis, but they're very interesting because they exist a lot more in the UK than in Germany, and a lot of my women whom I spoke to said that the UK is a lot less conservative than Germany, interestingly. But these women's networks are quite political. So what all of the junior women emphasized, they were like, so there are women's networks, but what about men's networks? Because they were not formalized, they actually had this perception that there were no male networks. And the first quote illustrates that quite nicely. This represents the drawback, which continues to be challenging because, of course, there's a lot out there for women. Women's networks, supporting programs for women. There's a mentoring program for women. And this is the moment when the other side says, and where am I as a man? That's the crux of the matter. And that's actually the same banker who said, there's inequality. No, there's no inequality. Oh, yes, there is inequality. So they were very much, it was very interesting that they didn't really dare to pick one side, so to say. And then there is again this emphasis that one of the senior bankers, where I put the quote up earlier, was also saying that men need to be included. I think it's the wrong way if women only organize themselves among each other in order to promote women, because it is not the status quo yet that women are in positions of responsibility. Which is why if you exclude men, you are never able to achieve a breakthrough. Because in order to achieve this aim, you have to work together with men. This is what I think is problematic about women-only networks. So to kind of draw some conclusions and implications for my future research, what became quite obvious that gender stereotypes matter a lot in finance, but there's very little said, or I didn't focus a lot on power mechanisms. So I'm really interested to see, is there like inherent power imbalance in finance, or is it just gender stereotypes? Because mostly gender stereotypes were referred to in my interviews. It was also quite obvious that women's work experience variegates spatially, so I mostly interviewed women in Frankfurt, only one was working in London, but because finance is so international, they worked in different places anyways, and they had a lot of contact with their counterparts in London. So I want to really figure out what is this gender dimension of financial centers, and how can it be, like, how can we explain the differences among these two places. And with regards to women's networks, there was this really interesting divide between junior and senior women, which I did not anticipate at all. So I think it's really interesting to actually ask what is wanted by women, because if you make those opportunities and they don't make use of them, then there's no point in banks saying, oh, we promote women because we have those networks. But if that's not what they want, if there's a mismatch between supply and demand, yeah, it's kind of a difficult point. And then the last thing that I'm very interested in, because as Timon mentioned, I'm trained in political theory, I'm really interested to see how these networks actually constitute spaces of political action that can challenge existing spaces of male power. And I kind of want to include with my favorite quote, because that was one woman. She was a junior banker, but she was almost working in the industry for about 10 years. And she was incredibly, like, she was put together the whole time, and she would never ever say anything or become too emotional, as you would probably dub it, about things. But then I asked her about how the industry, whether it was conservative or not, and she said, I mean, as a researcher, you love to have these quotes and then they give them to you. She said, I do believe that it's easier to be a man in finance because, as I said, I think this is a very conservative industry. Conservative for me also implies conservative gender roles. I come across them every day here. I come across them in the elevator. If I enter the elevator, men let me enter first. If I exit the elevator, men let me exit first. Although they might stand in front of me and need to step aside for me to leave from behind. This is absurd and I'm reluctant to leave the elevator every time because I cannot understand this. There is no physiological or logical explanation justifying this behavior. And she got super aggravated while she was saying that. So I found it very interesting, and it kind of probably speaks for itself that they were very hesitant to address the inequalities publicly, but there were those little things, if you paid attention, there was a lot of meaning to that. So that's kind of my end.
Thank you very much. So next is Jonas' presentation. Jonas did a degree in business studies and economics before he came here to Oxford to do development studies. And he spent the summer in Paraguay doing field work, and he's working on the formalization of the economy through tax reform.
Correct. Yes, as Kristina's presentation, my research is also based on qualitative research. So I can't claim any significance of how much a variable, a change in the tax reform has actually influenced the formalization process. And I can only hint towards potential causation. However, I think those hints might be relevant. Okay, so I did my research on my fieldwork in Paraguay last summer. I spent 2 months there and did 61 interviews, mostly with SMEs, policymakers, business associations and business unions, to get a general overview of the situation within the country. And yes, what is the idea about my research, or my research? So in most Latin and most developing countries, the informal economy is quite significant. If you measure it from the workforce, around 1/3 of the worldwide non-agricultural workforce is informal, so employers are not secured by social security and so forth. And if you measure informal economy, the informal market, by GDP, some studies account or measure it to up to 40% or even more in Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa and Central Asia. Paraguay is no exception to that. However, I don't focus on the workforce, I only focus on the GDP side, so the economic output. And generally, my definition of the informal sector would be, it's basically everything that is produced, sold in an economy, which is legal to be sold, so marijuana and any of those things, and which could potentially be taxed, but it's not for whatever reason. So because firms sell it without reporting it to the state and so forth. So all economic activities that would be generally be taxable where they're reported to the state. Why would it be interesting to tax the informal economy? This is all following the literature. First of all, it has potential revenue effects for the state, obviously. If around 40% of your economy, of your economic output is not taxed, that's a lot of revenue, tax revenue forgone. And for the firms itself, there's a quite big literature that talks about potential benefits. Once you formalize as an informal firm, you have better access to credit, first and foremost. You have growth possibilities. There's literature that talks about formalizing firms grow faster once they do so. Increased legitimacy, larger tax customer bases, and contract enforceability. And there's a third argument which goes down a political road, which basically argues for correlation and, argues for causation actually, between how broad the tax base is and how democratic the institutions are, which comes from a historical literature developing into a more temporary one, and basically follows the notion that people take, when they have to pay for something, more seriously how the money is spent. So once you force a customer in an informal economy or citizen in an informal economy in a developing country to formalize, to pay taxes, that person might be more interested in how the money is spent. So these three arguments would speak for a formalization. In regards to the latter point, that's just slight contemporary cross-sectional study measuring democracy, the level of democracy and tax reliance on the left, and the opposite on the right. So countries that more rely on resources, resources, revenues from oil, from extractive resources, they seem to be less democratic. Okay, what are the general means to tax or to formalize, for my definition, of the informal sector, at least the ones that the literature speaks about? That's firstly, one can tax indirectly, mostly via VAT or trade taxes. So if a firm buys products from a larger firm, it has to pay VAT. Another means would be via existing taxes. So basically that means you increase your VAT base or corporate income tax base or trade tax base via enforcing, so via enhancing supervision by the state and trying to control better that firms actually do not evade as much. Then you have the opportunity to tax via presumptive taxes or withholding taxes. The first one presumes you have a small firm or a micro firm, presumes a level of profit or income which is usually in that sector, say of 2 or 3%, and tax upon this without actually measuring how much they sell and buy. Withholding taxes would work from firm to firm level, so inter-business level, where the firm which is buying from the smaller one would withhold those taxes from that firm and pass them on to the state. Another means would be simplifying administrative procedures to formalize, to make it easier for firms. Or also administrative reforms which would be trying to systematically include segments or geographical areas of the informal economy within the market, within the tax structure. So, for instance, going through one area of the city and trying vigorously formalize every firm within that. However, all those approaches rely heavily on the capacity of the administrative the bureaucracy. And in developing countries, that's obviously an issue, considering human resources are not as developed, financial resources are not as much there either for those states. So that's a big backlash in that regard. So as I said, I did my research in Paraguay. Paraguay is characterized by informal economy of GDP around 40%, around 70%. Some studies talk even about 80% of the labor force is informal. However, they had two relevant tax reforms in 2004 and 2012, which is the reason I went there. So the outcome of the tax reforms in general were that the revenue to the state, so the GDP to tax revenue, increased from 8% to 12.9% between 2002 and 2015. There is a broader tax base, which is crucial for my research, and greater compliance also. The VAT gross compliance ratio improved, the CAT productivity increased, and there are a lot of administrative improvements. And I will explain the outcome of those, or the reason for those. So first of all, there was one reform in 2004, which is basically the main body of it. It follows the 10%, 10%, 10% rule, so it generalized VAT at 10%. It reduced the corporate income tax rate from 30% to 10%, so making it cheaper for firms, and it improved and digitized administrative procedures for firms to formalize and to stay formal and operate formal. And then, in 2012, a second reform was introduced, which was the country's first personal income tax, also taxed at 10%. Was initially suggested to be introduced with the 2004 reform. However, due to a lot of political pressure against it was not introduced until 2012, but that's a different story. The personal income tax is the novel approach within that tax reform. In usual countries, well, in the UK, I think it is the case. In Germany, it is definitely the case that if your personal income is taxed, you can deduct investments that you had to generate that income in the first place. So I need a laptop, I can deduct the tax I paid for this laptop from my personal income tax. In Paraguay, however, they allowed that every transaction, every market transactions, once this transaction is legally documented, so formal, can be deducted from the personal income tax. In other words, the tax is 100% deductible if all transactions I did were official. And the tax grows incrementally into the society. At its full application, around 10% or so of the population will be affected. However, of those 10%, the whole household, so as an example, if Charles would be a taxpayer, his whole household can use Charles' tax number and deduct the expenses that this household had with this, within this tax reform. Coming to the implications and now to my findings. From my interview findings, based on semi-structured open-ended interviews averaging around 60 minutes each, as I said, 61 interviews, I think 45 just with firms. From the very first to the very last interview, it was mentioned that yes, there's a significant formalization process within the economy. Firms themselves formalize and market transaction formalize. This is due to the reduced cost of being formal, so the decreased corporate income tax rate from 30 to 10%. Simplified bureaucratic procedures. It's considerably easier to register as a business. You can make it almost online. In the past, you had a lot of issues with bribery, with handing in your paperwork, and so forth. And crucially, ever more demand for invoices. Point B I leave out for now. Okay, I tried to explain what I just, well, obviously kind of explained already. So prior to the introduction of the personal income tax, if you, in Paraguay, you don't want to pay VAT on your market transactions, you would just buy informal. So you have a firm which might be registered actually, but the firm would also prefer to sell informal because it would decrease their corporate income tax, which is based upon their VAT statements. So customers as well as firms prefer to buy informal. Customers not to pay the VAT, and firms to have less corporate income taxes. And that obviously trickles down then, so from the suppliers up to the firm which sells to the customer. Where this does not mean, as I said, that the whole firm is informal. It might be half-half, and I had this in my interviews, which some were really formal, some were not formal at all in this formalization scale. However, with the introduction of the personal income tax, suddenly customers start to demand to have official transactions. So they want to pay VAT, because once they have the official invoice, they can deduct their personal income tax. Which then leads also firms wanting to buy formal, to pass the VAT from the supplier chain on to the final customers and deduct it from their statements or from their accounts, which leads to this formalization process. So I had firms talking to me, medium-sized and larger firms, that they pressure their suppliers to formalize, helping them with their accountants to set up the formal registration, to be able to continue to supply. And this increase in demand started exactly more or less at the time when the personal income tax was introduced around 2012. However, prior to this, the implication of the reform 2004 obviously had an effect as well. So you can see the number of formally active businesses was quite substantially already prior to this. So this is secondary data now directly from the government in Paraguay. The VAT compliance gap, which is basically measuring so how many transactions you have within a society and how many of those are actually taxed by VAT, improved quite significantly over the time. However, the crucial part is this, I think, This is the number of officially reported invoices. So from more or less August 2012, the red line is the introduction of the personal income tax, the deductible personal income tax. You see an increase quite substantially from 5 to over 12 million. This is just a number. The volume of those is the same. I have not put that slide inside, but it's also increasing, as well as VAT reported is increasing as well. Unfortunately, I don't have data further back, considering access is really difficult in that country. So I only have this much data, but it's backing up what I've heard from the first to the last interview throughout the whole process. And taxpayers are deducting, as it was intended by the reform, their businesses. So you can see the income reported and the expenses reported or declared to deduct the amount, which is, well, at least in 2015 and 16, almost the same. So people change their behavior and do deduct their expenses, whatever transaction it was. And it really includes any household products, from a glass of water, investments as well, to other normal products, even holidays if they're purchased in Paraguay itself. So if a travel agent in Paraguay sells you the trip to Brazil, you can deduct this as well. So the overall outcome is, while the 2004 reform made it cheaper and easier to formalize or to operate formal, the deductible personal income tax incentivizes the demand for officially documented purchases. And that brings me back to my slide, how the literature talks about how we can formalize in informal economy, where the main issue was that the capacity of the state itself to formalize the informal market is crucial with all those approaches that I listed, those 5 approaches. Whereas with this approach, the Paraguayan approach, it systematically nudges, first and foremost, customers and then firms, which trickles down the supply chain, to make every transaction formal. So basically you let the customer work for you as the state to formalize the economy. There are some examples talking about similar approaches in Brazil, in South Korea, I think, in Taiwan, in China, using a lottery system on every receipt. So you have a lottery number, and once a month or once a year you get a prize drawn. However, that also implies a lot of effort from the state and from the tax officials to implement this system. Where this one is just nudged by the customers itself. Okay, so much for my economic implications. The second questions I had in mind while doing the interview process, or the research process, which was actually my initial question that I had in mind, is once you have this wider tax base within a society, once ever more people get forced to pay more taxes to the state, what is the micro level change of the behavior of the taxpayers towards the government, towards the state? And I will not talk much about this, but from my interview responses that I had, and that's very hypothetical, I cannot claim as much causality as I tried to do with the previous economic implications, is that firms seem to organize themselves increasingly in business associations within the country to pressure the state for better accountability and public services and public goods. So while no direct engagement between formalized firm or firm itself that has to pay more taxes seems to be taking place between the state and the firm, which kind of makes sense, as a small firm is not able to contact the minister. A lot of new business associations seem to form, and old and established ones, and very powerful ones, throughout the bank reported that they have, especially in the last 4, 5, 6 years, increasing number of members that want to join, mostly small and medium-sized firms. And some even stated that especially those that recently formalized, so recently started to pay taxes, are the ones which are most eager to change things. So just have a few, so this then to the second set of interview findings. So formalized and formal firms feel entitled to demand public services, whereas informal firms clearly stated in interviews they don't seem to have this rights to demand something from the state because they don't pay. And they seem to organize, at least in the Paraguayan context, via business associations. In that case, it's interesting because the literature mostly talks about the big macro implications, what happens after a couple of years, or how does the stage changes to that. But there's not much talk about or much evidence about how firms or taxpayers actually change their behavior once they're forced to pay. So I just have a few quotes. I think the first two are actually sufficient. Incorporating ever more people into the tax system made the people more attentive to how the state is using the tax contributions. That's from a business association, reading one. The second one as well. The one who legalizes his business and pays his taxes react in a different manner. He realizes that the ministry is his employee who has to help him. They organize in associations to have more power and help and voice. And the last one is just talking about what is in general demanded from what firms demand business associations to address to the state in that regard. Yeah, that's me so far.